If one were to think of an overarching theme for international relations in these 2 decades so far, what captures it most accurately would be the big title: Decline of Unipolarity, the Rise of a Multipolar World. So, even as this unipolar moment began in the 90s, there were some analysts in the United States who realized that this window of opportunity offered by that moment in history could be very short lived unless the United States developed a new grand strategy, so to say, for maintaining that dominance. Now, there were two routes for ensuring this hegemony or maintaining this hegemony in the international system: of course, geostrategic and geoeconomic. But to get the story to where we are in time now, there were disasters on both fronts of USA's grand strategy. Now, first, of course, the global war on terror, envisioned as a grand strategy project for creating a new American century. Well, it ended in the disastrous exit that we all saw recently from Afghanistan. Well, these almost farce-like images we saw was only a culmination of a long stretched out failure, a defeat, one might say, in this round of the new great game. But to move on the geoeconomic front as well, the economic crisis of 2008, created by an accumulation of systemic dysfunction in the finance industry, in the economy of the United States and the global financial system, well, that depressed the US economy to say the least, and its effects continue to be felt till now in some cases. So, I always like to keep bringing in a little bit of theory. So, just to get slightly theoretical in terms of world systems theory, whenever there is a system-wide crisis, or an interconnected segment of the world system goes through a connected crisis, that is called a B phase, a downturn in that systemic economy. So, we might say that the financial crisis of 2008 created a system-wide B phase in the Western segment of the world system economy. So, even as the West was going through a B phase, China was still at the lag end of its A phase, which is the rise of China's economy, which has been going on for decades now. So whenever you see a B phase in one power and a simultaneous A phase in another power, that always gives that rising power an opportunity to close the gap, so to say, between itself and the old superpower or the old hegemon. So, what does the old power do in this case? So, as Paul Kennedy says in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, there is always a lag time in the international system between when a rising power finally catches up with its opponent, who is in relative decline, who is in this B phase, or just who is caught up in a stagnating economy while its rival is going through a rapid A phase, so to say. So, if the old power understands this, if it understands these systemic dynamics, it can make the right investments in its own power, in its own economy, and it can stretch this lag time and prevent its opponent from catching up. So we see the rise of China as, of course, the other dominant theme in the 21st century. And this other scholar and diplomat, Kishore Mahbubani, who is from Singapore, both a writer and a diplomat, he described the rise of China as part of a wave of Asian resurgence which began from Japan in the 70s and 80s, then into South Korea, into Southeast Asia, and then into India in the 90s. So this was a system-wide A wave beginning from Japan. And ironically, this created an integrated sphere of Asian prosperity, and the effects of which are still being felt. Of course, maybe this wave is moving further eastward, and perhaps we can include now the Arab world into this, and perhaps also other regions. That remains to be seen. So what is all this leading up to? The question I am going to explore now today is, was the G20 Summit that happened in Indonesia recently a marker of such a moment in international history? So perhaps it was not quite as historic as the Bandung Conference of 1955, which marked the beginning of the rise of the post-colonial world. But seeing this in continuity, perhaps this is a marker of that ongoing journey. So fitting that it also occurred in Indonesia. The importance of this G20 summit can be seen in the declaration signed at the end of the summit. So I'll just put up some excerpts here. You can pause the video and take a look at them. So I'll just read out some, just draw out some important themes from these two excerpts that I have shared on the screen. So what do we get from this? First, note that the general theme and recognition of the G20 now being the chief global forum for coordination, especially for geoeconomic diplomacy but also other important global matters, replacing the G7, has been recognized, and this has become entrenched in the international system. So this is an important moment, a shift away from the G7 to the G20. Second, now note in the second paragraph, especially this phrase that most members condemn Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The most here is important. There is a crucial difference between the G20 and the G7. More importantly, this phrase reflects USA's inability to impose a common geopolitical outlook on the G20, which again is a reflection of the relative power of other nations who are part of this group, who feel they are strong enough to resist this common agenda. And I don't mean that in the negative sense, but just agenda as your plan or policy or cohesive outlook. So, yeah, they're strong enough to resist this and, importantly, capable enough to actually do it and get this implemented. So, of course, if we look within the group, China naturally is by now a dominant pole in the international system in its own right. But there are also other important actors like India, which in fact played a crucial role in working this specific language into the draft. And of course, Indonesia, which is the host of the summit itself. In fact, Indonesia had to resist a lot of pressure to prevent a boycott of Russia from the summit. And the compromise position was to invite Zelensky to address the summit as well, which he did through video conference. Now, so, moving on, I would argue that this summit is an important moment as a historical signpost marking the emergence of this multipolar international order. So in previous geopolitics reports, I have covered, in fact, the last one, I covered the Biden-Xi meeting and the easing of tensions between USA and China. I would even say that this is a consequence of the pressures being created by multipolarity in the international system, because now in the international system there exist other important actors who will not bend easily to the whims of the super dominant hegemons. This in fact forces the hegemons or the superpowers themselves to act both with other powers and themselves in a more nuanced way. So the historical parallel to this would be in fact the concept of Europe, which again is one of the most interesting eras in world history that we might look into in more depth in the future. So now, particularly now, there is a cluster of powers on the periphery of both USA and China. So in the West, of course, to check USA, there would be Russia, even Brazil and France from time to time. In the East, to check China, there is Japan, the ASEAN nations, India and Australia. Remember, these nations cooperate amongst themselves. Well, not USA and Russia now, but till the recent past. They cooperate, but they also create tensions which prevent the sphere of influence of the local hegemon in this quarter of the world from becoming, well, super hegemonic. So in many instances, these superpowers are also forced to engage with what we might call lower scale powers on an equal basis. So we see this in China's participation in the APEC summit, which followed the G20 summit, or in USA's case in the IPEF, or Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was signed earlier this year, as attempts to create influence in blocs through more direct and nuanced means. But again, things get interesting when we see within these blocs, these new blocs, and we see that even they have overlapping memberships. So for instance, India is part of the Quad, India is part of the SCO, and as we will see, India is also part of another group of countries called the BASIC, countries which negotiate together in international forums. We'll come to that towards the end of this presentation. So make no mistake that these decisions are calculated moves by actors to nurture multipolarity, especially when they decide to join different blocs and have memberships in blocs that sometimes, overtly on the face of it, might seem opposed to each other. So take Turkey. In recent decades, Turkey, of course, has emerged as a significant regional pole. While overtly Turkey has been supporting Ukraine through weapon deliveries and maintaining supply routes and in diplomatic forums, it has also been balancing relations with Russia One could interpret Turkey's opposition to Finland and Sweden joining NATO as part of this internal balancing. Even otherwise, Turkey has become a go between for covert negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, such as the recent grain export deal. So, in terms of grand strategy, for some years now, Turkey has been exhibiting signs of a desire to create its own sphere of influence, or a larger Turkic world, or Great Turan as it is called. There is already a Turkic Council with membership of Turkic language speaking countries, which meets annually. Now, just like there are overlapping memberships in groups, this Turkic world also overlaps in many regions with the Iranic world and even with the so called Russian world. In fact, I argued in one of my live podcasts some time ago that conflicts in the international system arise not between civilizations, as Huntington very reductively put it in his book, but in places where there are overlapping worlds or overlapping conceptions of worlds. And these are linguistic, cultural, or religious identities which are entrenched into geographic spaces. And this is, in fact, exactly what we are seeing in Ukraine, where there is an overlap between the so called Russian world, the Ukrainian world, and the Western world. Different conceptions of worlds which are trying to determine the trajectory that they will follow for the future. So these clashes between worlds often break out as wars within civilizations rather than being clashes between civilizations. So no one would say, for instance, that Ukraine and Russia are part of distinct civilizations. They are part of one civilizational entity but have different conceptions of the worlds that they belong to and the worlds that they want to belong to in the future. So these are, of course, always more interesting to look at than this reductive analysis of clashes between blocks of civilizations, which is an idea that should be thrown into the dustbin of history. So what are some more instances of this? So we talk of worlds as being linguistic, cultural, religious, or any other identity-based self-conception that people have. So take, for instance, the continuing stress between the Anglophone and the Francophone world, right? In fact, in Africa, this often breaks out into actual violent conflict from time to time. And this is, again, both a legacy of the past, but also something as these nations who belong to either the Anglophonic or the Francophonic world see as their future. So this is what we mean by this clash between worlds. What people see as their past, what people see as their present, their identity in the present, and what people want to determine their identity to be in the future. That is, this is the world we want to continue belonging to. And these are the clashes that actually occur when different worlds collide and one world tries to impose its conception of what the future should be like on another world. Right? Again, the biggest example of this is the actual war which is going on, but you see this on the edges of various other nations, such as China's own frontier problems in the western and the northern regions, which again is something that is ongoing and should never be forgotten or be ignored. So before I close, let's just briefly discuss another important matter. So the International Energy Agency recently released a report which has laid out quite starkly the energy crisis which has broken out, as the agency says, in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. While still far from the scale of the 1973 oil shock, in which oil prices rose almost overnight by 300%, the impact of the current crisis has been felt across the world, and worst of all, by household economies of working people. Europe has particularly felt the brunt of this gas crisis, especially as it is heavily reliant on stable gas supply from Russia. So as the European Union attempts to reduce its reliance on Russian gas, demand and consequently prices have risen in the international market. So this week, diplomats were meeting in Brussels to attempt to build a consensus, to build a common gas policy for Europe. But again, there are tensions within the bloc. So the overarching goal of this consensus plan, according to the EU president, is to bolster the union's joint gas purchasing. However, several countries are skeptical, and chief among them, as should be expected, is France. So at a meeting of France's leading industrialists, the president, Emmanuel Macron, chose to put the blame for the crisis in Europe on the United States, calling its attitude not friendly. So USA has been criticized by France even before, in fact consistently since last month, when the finance minister of France, Bruno Le Maire, went on an attack saying that USA was using Russia's war in Ukraine to bring about American economic domination and a weakening of Europe. So he further added that we cannot accept that our American partner sells its liquid natural gas at 4 times the price at which it sells it to its own companies. And he further added, he reiterated the call to create a more balanced economic relationship on the energy issue between our American allies and the European continent. So Macron repeated this issue and he said that the United States is a producer of cheap gas and they sell at a high price to us. This warrants urgent correction. So in recent years, the United States and Europe have failed to see eye to eye on a number of issues, whether it is trade regulations with China, gas imports from Russia, cyberspace regulations, and international taxation and various other issues. So while many analysts had cited Donald Trump's presidency as a cause for this strain in USA and Europe's relationship, the European Union's relationship, the continuing stress also attests to deeper problems. So the question is, can this be linked to the overall trajectory or the shifting calculus of global geopolitics towards multipolarity? So I think it explains it well, because fundamentally Europe has long desired to be a global leader, especially in terms of framing of norms in the international system, whether it be various issues of global governance or climate change. France, of course, wants to be a strong hard power actor as well. But this more often runs up against USA's grand strategy of entrenching its own unipolar position, particularly in its Western sphere of influence as the predominant superpower in the international system. So France, of course, desires to become a dominant regional pole in its own right, while maintaining its own sphere of influence in Francophone Africa. It seeks at the same time to extend its presence in other arenas of global geopolitical competition, such as the Indian Ocean. It is often forgotten that France has important and strategic territories in the Indian Ocean and sees itself as a resident power in this global geopolitical hotspot. Well, another crucial factor in analyzing these emerging strains is that the internal balance of power within the European Union has been severely shaken by Brexit on the one hand and Germany's economic problems on the other, or you might even call it Germany's indecisiveness. Now, Germany's grand strategy, if it had one till last year, was largely to play the game of global geoeconomic competition through geoeconomic diplomacy. It had maintained a somewhat non-aligned position, remaining a vital actor in the West-led liberal international order, while building bridges with Russia and China. And as will be evident due to this ongoing disarray in the international system, core aspects of the strategy are, also in disarray. So, these developments show the complexity of the emerging international system and how pressures in one domain can have cascading effects in others across this entire system of international politics. I always say that you have to imagine the system not just in terms of two dimensions, such as you tend to see in visual representations of global power, especially in maps, but you have to see this world as a multiplex world, in which there are different interests in different domains and different alliances in different domains. So these domains broadly are, of course, the geopolitical, the geoeconomic, the geostrategic, and the geotechnological, but you can divide them into subdomains as well. So one example of these different positionings in different domains was at the recent climate change negotiations. This was the COP27 Summit at Sharm el Shaikh, Egypt. Now here, this group of 4 countries, which is known as the Basic Group, which includes Brazil, India, South Africa, and China, clubbed together to oppose certain international proposals being pushed by the European Union. This was regarding a proposed international carbon border tax. So the Basic Group put out a statement saying that it reiterated doubts about developed countries showing leadership or responding with a matching progression of effort. So they pointed out that the developed countries had increased their consumption and production of fossil fuels while also backtracking on various other financial and mitigation commitments and pledges. And they concluded that this was a double standard which was incompatible with climate equity and justice. So of course the argument of these countries is that the historic producers of greenhouse gases have been Western countries, and they continue to be amongst the largest consumers and producers of fossil fuel. And they should build a more equitable regime, which should involve transfers of especially finances from the West to the East. So, the overarching theme, like I said, should be the rise of the multipolar world. But alongside this emerging multipolarity, we also have to take into account the multiplex nature of this world, in which there are different alliances, different positionings, and different interests of actors in different domains of international relations. And for us who are interested in analyzing international politics and geopolitics, it is not enough to simply follow day-to-day events, but we have to structure them into this larger picture of the evolving nature of the international system.